I would just like to also thank everyone that came in. I mean, just as a very short identification, but Andrew Zimbalist is quite possibly the most noted sports economist in the country, a professor at Smith, and I think baseball and billions changed more views of the baseball industry than any book, maybe until Moneyball, but and what would be fascinating, very soon coming out, his new book, Moneyball Revisited, which will be a very interesting study of the last decade. Joe Petrowski is CEO of Gulf Cumberland Farms, has been had a 10-year relationship as a sponsor with the Red Sox for Gulf, and has been he's an editor at Wall Street Journal, a fascinating man, and also a great fan, I might say. Craig, as you know, is now in his 9th year as a major league pitcher, and if you Google him, yes, you will immediately see Sporting News keeps referring to him as the smartest athlete in the United States. But if I might just, for a plug, if you want to go Google strikeone.org, his foundation, which last year I think he raised more than $1 million for research and study of pediatric cancer. And his events every November are amazing. And this is all something he started. And it started small, I know from going to the first event. But one of the most interesting people in the sport, and a great representative of what you can do with this business. I think you all know Theo. I think most of you know Billy. There are a couple of world championships since Billy took over as general manager in '98. I believe you have the 4th best winning percentage in the American League, and you do not have the 1st highest payroll. So, but with that, and everyone on the panel is just going to jump in, and we're trying to make this discussion. I'm just going to start with a couple of questions, and the first one is to Billy. What is the biggest difference between the baseball industry, and particularly the what was termed Moneyball, in 2002 when Michael Lewis was basically living the year with the A's, and this year right now?
Well, the biggest difference, and we talked a little bit before when I was visiting with some of the people, the level, I think, sophistication that is in baseball front offices. I sort of see Theo and my former assistant, Paul DePodesta, as sort of being the first of a breed that really was being accepted into the game. Now we're getting an opportunity. And if you look at front offices now, and I jokingly say this, but I'm only half joking, is that I won't be able to apply for my own job in 10 years because there's some really, really incredibly bright people who didn't necessarily play the game, but because, once again, the game has changed significantly, are now not only embraced, but we're looking for them. I mean, I've got a young man who attended MIT here, Farhan Zaidi. He's our director of baseball operations. In fact, didn't even grow up in this country. And he's number 3 man on the A's depth chart. He holds a PhD from Cal Berkeley in behavioral economics. And these are the type of resumes now that you're seeing in the game. And it makes the game and the sport better, in my opinion.
What interests me is someone who is as passionate about baseball. You always were, going back to being on the traveling squad in the playoffs in like '89. But knowing Theo's passion, when did you start to look at not only analytics, but also finding undervalued properties and assets?
Well, I think that's probably always been there. You know, I think Branch Rickey was doing that and a long time ago, and hired a statistician to help better evaluate players so we could identify the undervalued ones. And that's been around as long as the game has been. I think to kind of tie it back to your first question, thanks to a lot of the innovations that Billy is responsible for, and the success that he had, and the charismatic way that he had the success, the landscape has changed fundamentally, where it's so much harder to find any type of competitive advantage or undervalued player now than it was. My first offseason as Red Sox GM was 2002, 2003. And, we looked at our roster and realized, hey, we could really use a few hitters who get on base and drive the ball a little bit. Let's see what's available out there this winter. Oh, there's David Ortiz, just released on a one-year deal. There's Bill Miller, available on a small 2-year deal with a club option, won the batting title the next year. There's Kevin Millar. Oh, no one wants him. He's going to Japan. Okay, let's tell him we might be interested in his services and sign him to a very reasonable 2-year deal. So that same exercise right now would probably require hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, years of waiting for that player to possibly become available, and then having to outwork and outbid 10 to 12 competitors for that player's services. So it's just the landscape has fundamentally changed as teams push the envelope farther and farther on how accurately they can value players and value all aspects of the game. So teams do have their proprietary information, and they look at players slightly differently, but it's been a sea change as far as the commonalities that exist out there in valuing players, making the landscape flat and a lot more difficult. And I often yearn for the days of 2002 and 2003, when things were a lot easier on all of us.
Now, there aren't too many people that once in a while in the media they'll refer to, for instance, your former staff in Boston as sun-deprived nerds, which is kind of funny. They went to school and they studied the game in a lot of ways. But, Billy, who was the first person? Was it Sandy Alderson that really introduced you to this field?
Yeah, I mean, Sandy, as many of you guys have baseball fans who's running the New York Mets, was my business mentor in some respect. Not in some, he was. And it was really Sandy who introduced me to really looking at the game in a different way. I had experienced it as a player. And you understand there's a lot of intellectual capital back in Oakland back then. You had Tony La Russa as the manager. You have Dave Duncan as the pitching coach, who arguably may be the first pitching coach who could go into the Hall of Fame. So there was a lot of brain power there. It was a very stimulating environment to be around. And I think the eureka moment for me came, he'd been handing me these Bill James pamphlets and some other guys, and I'd kind of thumb through them. And we were at the World Series in 1993, Philadelphia Phillies, and I think it was Toronto Philly that year. But all I remember was the Phillies, because they really epitomized offensively what all these manuals that Bill James had been writing about for years. So from that point on, I was gathering everything I could from Sandy. And Sandy has the original Bill Jameses that are just basically typed. And and in being, once again, Sandy's background, he didn't come up through the game as a player, so he didn't have the traditional maybe biases that you might have in a business where you come up through the ranks and you don't necessarily question things. So for me, it was definitely Sandy, and listen, and I think it's no secret, I think Theo would say the same thing. Bill James had a huge impact on this game. I mean, he's now finally being recognized, and I think all of us, to some extent, are somewhat of a disciple of his.
Peter, can I want to emphasize and pick up on a point that Theo made, because sabermetrics, which is the discipline of studying baseball with statistics and studying baseball analytically, is a dynamic element. It's not static. And what was true, as it was characterized by Michael Lewis in Moneyball in his 2003 book, was that people historically, even though Alan Roth and Branch Rickey acknowledged this, it had still been fundamentally overlooked by all teams. It was true that people were undervaluing walks and undervaluing on-base percentage and concentrating on batting average. You only really needed somebody with high school algebra in terms of their mathematical preparation to be able to appreciate that. Okay. Now, and after that, some more sophisticated insights came along about pitching and dips, which we can get into later. But the point I want to make to you now is that I think that the kind of insight that was available to Paul DePodesta and Billy Beane in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that was low-hanging fruit. That was pretty easy. That was something that people, again, going back to Alan Roth and others in the 1940s, had pointed out. Just nobody had taken advantage of it. Now they're dealing with, how are we going to create measurements to figure out who the best fielder is? You don't want to use fielding percentage anymore because that was a statistic that only had meaning in the 19th century when players were wearing the equivalent of golf gloves on their hands. And it was a real question. If a ball is hit to you, you're going to convert it or not. What Bill James pointed out with his range factor is that in addition to completing a ball that's hit to you, how far can you move to your right? How far can you move to your left? What kind of a jump do you get on the ball? How do you position yourself? That turns out to have a very large impact on fielding success. How do we then create a statistic that tells us how good a fielder, a shortstop is? It's very easy to add OBP. We know exactly what OBP is. It's batting average plus on base percentage. And nobody disputes that. But everybody disputes if you use, say, the most commonly used defense statistic, UZR, everybody disputes that. And if you look at an individual player's UZR from one year to the next, the correlation is about 0.3 to 0.35 to 0.40. It's the same as BABIP. It's very, very low. So we have new technologies. We have new cameras pointing at the players. We have the promise of Field FX. There's promise going forward, but to be able to identify and tease out and then take advantage of any new insights is going to be much, much more difficult going forward. And so one of the interesting arguments in Lewis's book about how, because Billy Beane was smarter than the other GMs, and he was able to innovate in the application of OBP, and he was able, as a small market team on a low payroll, to become a very competitive team. So to some degree, Lewis was telling us, we can solve baseball's competitive balance problem with sabermetrics. Well, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to do that. It's going to be much more difficult and complicated going forward.
I'd like to ask, because knowing both of you very well, Theo and Billy, and over the years, it's been very interesting to me to see how you've evolved in different things you looked at, going from on-base percentage and college players to more and more to high school players and to the different defensive dynamics. How much of that is a function of the market and the economy, or how much is a function of just how each of you have changed your views of the game?
I think it's a combination of how our views and valuing players has changed as we've been able to quantify different aspects of play, and then also, importantly, our reactions to the marketplace. So while the draft, or the other, let's say 26, 27 teams were really placing tremendous emphasis on high school players, and despite the vast projection that requires, there was tremendous value to be found in the certainty of college players, field of players for which we had more accurate projections based on their track records. But pretty quickly, and I think the publication of Moneyball helped the speed of this insight across the game. Pretty quickly, the entire industry caught on and started to value college players in the draft to such a point that they became overvalued. Good high school players were falling into later rounds because there was such a rush to scoop up the higher performing college players. So at that point, it just became good business to circle back and get solid value with the high school players. So I think there are always parallel fronts where you're looking to really refine your valuation of all the different aspects of play and to accurately value players, and then also having, and I think Billy does this very well, having your finger on the pulse of the market, so you can see what is being valued in the market, because really potential acquisition is only valuable to you if you value something that others don't, and that's where you can really make your hay, whether it's in the draft or trades or free agency.
If I could just very quickly point out that, and Billy, correct me if I don't have this exactly right, between 2002 and 2011, the Oakland A's had something like 25 first-round picks, and they were all high school kids that he picked. In 2012, he had 3 first-round picks, and he picked 3 college kids. And I think this speaks to what Theo was just saying, and to really all of these new metrics. The marketplace responds initially slowly, and then it can overreact. So whereas walks can be undervalued for a long time, all of a sudden they can be overvalued. And then somebody who's kind of an obscurantist and laggard and not introducing any sabermetrics at all can start benefiting from not appreciating the value of OBP.
If I I say until people generally get sick of hearing it, I am a huge baseball fan, but baseball and business are quite similar. Sabermetrics has really infected business. I'm old enough to remember when HR processed the payroll checks and made sure everybody complied with the dress code. And today we're in a talent hunting business, and we use not the same principles, but different principles. In our trading business, for example, when I harkened back when I spent a year in my career, I came up through the trading branch. I remember when I took an aptitude test, the person at Harvard said, "You should be a cartologist." And I didn't even know, having graduated from Harvard, what a cartologist was. And I realized that industry had peaked in the 14th century. But today what we find is people who are good at spatial relationships, numerical relationships, make better traders. We're screening in our stores for people who have what I call marketing personalities. So our human resources department is really now like the GM, and we have the debates internally. Should we get someone out of high school, or should we get people out of college or with MBAs? So interesting enough, as we have debates, looking for talent, looking for future talent, probably not much different from Brad Pitt and George. I'm just jealous, that's all. I mean, here I'm sitting next to a guy who George Clooney will play in the movie. And Brad Pitt played him, and all that would play me, if I ever have a movie, is James Gandolfino. So I'm jealous. But I say very often, baseball and business are quite similar. And if you don't innovate, if you don't try to stay ahead of the curve, you'll just end up keep slipping.
Yeah, Andrew touched on it when he first started speaking. I mean, business, everything's fluid. Things are changing. There's no sort of template. And talking about, for us, we have to do things differently in Oakland. I mean, what a big market club would like for us to do is do things exactly the way they do it and mimic what they're doing. We have to be somewhat disruptive in our space because of our revenue situation. But any decision in any business, and particularly in baseball, really comes down to information. There's the absolutes of, say, 10 years college players. It was really because we had more information on college guys. If a kid from USC played a kid from Arizona State, he played him a couple times a year. We saw him for 3 years. They weeded out through injury, so we were making better selections. And when it comes to high school kids, we're doing a better job because we have more access to information. And that's really what every decision, whether it be baseball or business, is based upon. Hedging yourself with information and trying to create a probability that you'll be more successful than the others. And technology has really, as much as any business, has helped baseball because we're gathering more and more accurate information. And the difference is we're keeping it to ourselves, and Theo's not inviting Michael Lewis into his office to write a book about it. So.
When my old boss, and we were very statistically today we still are at the company, car counts, locations, demographics, when we put stores or stations. But I can remember my old boss, who would beat into me, was my mentor, about having the information, having the statistics, said to me, "Son, the race doesn't always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but that's the way you should bet."
Craig, you've played for both.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I've got the unique perspective of being waived, released, designated for assignment by both GMs on this panel.
Well, I claimed you and Brady. Well, what a higher level.
I think I did twice.
I think both of you did. But no, I think it's also interesting that I kind of have the perspective of being a player through this shift toward analytics. I've also been probably a victim and a beneficiary of this Moneyball philosophy. Playing in Oakland through my first arbitration year, not necessarily being so cost efficient anymore, being shipped onto a place like Boston eventually. But I also think this analytic-driven approach has permeated down through players. I can remember 2011, which was statistically, in the most fundamental statistics, my worst year in terms of ERA and those types of things, feeling like I was throwing the ball pretty well. And I can remember thinking to myself, it seems like every time a ball is put in play, it's a base hit. Well, now this information was readily available to me. I could check out my batting average on balls in play, and it was, in fact, close to 500. So there was some truth to the fact that I was executing pitches. My strikeouts were consistent. My walks were consistent. Line drive percentages were consistent. So all those kind of peripheral statistics remained consistent, and yet I was just giving up more hits and as a result more runs. But what it told me was I don't need some fundamental shift in my approach. If I can kind of stay with this eventually over the course of months or seasons, my numbers will kind of regress to what their consistent levels had been. And so without making a huge change in the way that I pitched in 2012, I went right back in line with what my career numbers had always been and had another good year, not for the A's.
They're too expensive for us, Greg. That's right.
But don't you think there's a little bit of a misconception that it's entirely done? I mean, especially the people that there are people that just refuse to accept that they don't, Moneyball is almost like an obscenity to certain people who follow the game, who write the game, and who sit and watch games. And but I take the Cespedes signing. Now, I mean, in my mind, he should have been 5th or 6th in the league at MVP last year. You signed him out of Cuba. Now, there aren't too many analytics on Cespedes. How important was the scouting element in that?
Well, it's a part of every decision we make, player personnel. That being said, it wasn't completely subjective either, because we all have access to objective information, even on a player like Yoenis Cespedes. So we weren't completely flying without a net analytically. And I've got some pretty interesting emails from Farhan, and basically trying to make a guess at what this guy would do in the major leagues based on his previous history, albeit a limited amount of information in Cuba. So it was certainly a little bit of both in that case. But I don't think anybody in any business anymore is really making a decision completely from the gut anymore. There's just too much information out there and available to us. And even with a guy like Yoenis, you had some objective information that you could use. And we were fortunate that it seemed to work. He's a great player and a great talent. And the other thing too, it was also about access to this type of player for us. This had he been available in November, we probably weren't in a position to sign him. But by the time he was actually able to sign with a club, a lot of clubs had exhausted their funds. So we were one of the few clubs that actually had some capital available. And as I was explaining to Andrew before, this was the type of player that was not available to us normally in Oakland. He's right in the prime of his career at 26 years old, at a reasonable cost relative to his position. And once again, there was a lot of teams that were not involved that probably would have been involved back in November had he been available. So there's a certain amount of study, some analytics, some scouting, and a little bit of luck and fortune at the timing as well.
If it had been $45 million, was it possible?
Well, if you're giving me the benefit of hindsight, every decision I'm at 45. Oh, yeah, absolutely, I would have given $45 million because it would have been worth it. But listen, I can tell you when you're spending that kind of money in our marketplace, that was at $36 million we ended up spending. That's a big chunk of change for us. So we were certainly a little bit concerned. I think the biggest relief for me last season, the most exciting moment was in Japan with Cespedes hit a home run the second game to win it. Because you just felt like that was his sort of coming out party, that he was going to be able to compete at this level, because we really didn't have a lot of information on him.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there has been such a polarization of the camp, so to speak, between scouting and sabermetricians, because the ironic part is, at least in my experience, like the deeper you dig into the numbers, the more it pushes you to master the scouting perspective as well. Because if you look at any decision we make, if you're talking about a major league player, major league players have established track records. Pretty much every organization has the same information on those players, and they're either they've been trending up, in which case you're not going to acquire them because they're not on the market, or they're trending down, and you're often trying to figure out the question, well, why is this player trending down? Is he hurt? Is he finished? Is it something mechanical or fundamental? Can this player be fixed? And there are answers to those questions in the numbers if you dig deep enough, but there are oftentimes answers to those questions through the scouting lens as well, and that type of information is extremely valuable. college players, in the draft, there's more uniformity of opinion on the college players because we have the track records to guide us. And I think there's still, despite the greater information that's available now in high school players, I think still the single most important evaluation we get on the high school player is directly from scouts. And so being able to evaluate your own scouts, put them in position to make the right decisions, having better efficiency with deploying those resources, how many times we get looks at those players, seeing them in environments that are going to be more indicative of future success than otherwise. It's just, the more you dig into the numbers, the more objective you try to get, the more you realize how fundamentally important it is to have at least 2 or 3 or 4 guys around you that you really trust to make a good, solid, subjective evaluation of a player.
I don't know why there are two camps between what I call the subjective evaluation of an individual and the objective have to really be in conflict. In business, we do that all the time. I mean, it's business like baseball is about the numbers, but we don't hire anybody or we don't promote or demote anybody without a subjective assessment. How do they make the people around them better or worse? And I can also remember from my mentor once when we fired an individual and he brought him in because I had been reluctant as the number 2 guy to fire him. Brought him in and said, "Son, let me be brief. Your personality your numbers aren't big enough to carry that personality." Now that may be sensitive with what we went through as Boston fans last year, but when I went out of the room and he did the firing, we gave him good severance, but I said to him, "I'm amazed that you picked up that line." He says, "Well, when I got a divorce the first time, I said to my first wife, you're not good looking enough to carry that personality." I said, "Oh, that divorce must have went really well." But, yes, business is about numbers, but when we evaluate talent in the organization, how they work with other people, how they treat, how they act during a crisis, how they make a decision when no one's watching is as important as the numbers.
Even though I'm an economist, let me play amateur psychologist just for a second with regard to this question about the conflict between statisticians and scouts. I think it's generally the case that if somebody is really smart and pretty secure in who he or she is, that they're more open to innovative ideas. And if they're less smart and more insecure, then they're more threatened by innovative ideas. So one of the things I think that happened in Oakland and what happened in Boston under Theo and what's happening in Tampa right now, and by the way, Tampa has 8 different people in their analytics department. It's the largest one in baseball. What's happening is you have really smart people who are running the front offices who are very open to innovative techniques and not threatened by them. And one of the things about not being threatened by it is allowing 2 methodologies to mix. And it's very common today, for instance, and I know many of the analytics people in the Tampa Bay Rays organization, the analytics people are spending most of their time looking at video. They're doing analytical work on video, not directly on numbers.
I'll say this. I spent a day with Andrew Friedman and Joe Madden this spring. And it was really interesting because the relationship is so good. Andrew is very respectful of Joe's 25, 30 years in baseball development. And it was interesting to hear Joe talk about when Andrew would come to him about certain ideas and things he didn't agree with. Joe was open to it. Have both of you found that today it's easier to have managers understand that there is that blend of the human and the statistical?
You're the manager expert.
Well, I'm lucky. I've got I got Bob Melvin, who his background is very unique in a sense. He was a major league player, but he went to work on Wall Street when he got done playing. So, which is not too many ex-players going to do that. So he spent 5 years doing that. We came up in the same generation. I mean, he went to Cal Berkeley. You're talking about a really bright guy. So our working relationship, his working relationship with the front office is very, very unique. And he was manager of the year last year and he deserved to be manager. He should have been manager of the decade for what he did last year. But the unique thing was the relationship he has. I mean, he's searching out information from us that maybe those questions weren't asked 10 years ago. And so we're pretty lucky in Oakland. I got the perfect guy, at least for the way we operate. And he's just so bright and he's so inquisitive. And works very well, very good synergy between us, Farhan, David Forrest, our assistant GM, Dan Feinstein. So I can't speak for Theo.
Yeah, the bar is a lot higher these days. I think that any quality manager will be curious about ways to make better decisions. And I think even in a situation where the manager wasn't being provided information by the front office, he'd be on the computer himself looking for that information, or else he'd be operating at a disadvantage. So I think the bark is greater than the bite when it comes to the fear of youthful front offices forcing reams of information down managers' throats. I don't think that's actually the dynamic. I think there might be the fear of that initially, but once managers get hired and start working with the front offices, there's usually a great synergy develops where the information that's not relevant or doesn't help the manager make decisions the way he wants to make decisions falls by the wayside, and he discovers new information that the front office can provide that just helps him do his job better in a way he's comfortable with. So I don't think there's great controversy there.
How much work do each of you do on makeup before you make a trade?
You go first, yeah.
Quite a bit, but it's an inexact science. I think. Well, let me answer for Billy, where I think Billy might see makeup as an opportunity, where he can find a talented player who might get labeled as less valuable than he should be because of something that happened in his past or some reputation, or he's not nice to the media, or he doesn't seek out ways to enhance his reputation, and that just creates an undervalued asset that Billy can pluck and put into the relative vacuum of Oakland and make it work and add more talent to his roster, and that's what he needs to do because of his market. In Boston, it's kind of the other end of the spectrum, where if you don't pay enough attention to makeup, you can wake up and have a situation like we experienced here, where all of a sudden the whole does not quite equal the sum of the parts, and any potential conflict or any bad fit really gets amplified here because of the unique interaction between the fan base, the media, and the insular environment of the clubhouse. So it's something that you certainly have to consider, but I think understanding your marketplace and understanding where there might be opportunities created by that is important as well.
I don't know if this is an urban legend. I'm sorry.
No, Theo.
I was going to say, from a business perspective, this is from Goldman. But what I'm told Goldman does on interviews now is they'll watch the candidate. They'll put some magazines in front of the candidate. They'll also serve him a cup of coffee, see how he thanks the receptionist. Is he polite? What magazine does he pick up to read? So if you're interviewing for an internship, pick up Foreign Affairs if it's there, or not motorsports.
Are you putting Goldman forward as a model or an anti-model?
No, what I'm saying is character in business becomes extremely important. So I don't know if it's important to Billy. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. I mean, and Theo was kind of there's 30 different businesses. We all do things differently because our markets dictate that we should. I mean, Craig can tell you the environment in Oakland is much different. So the perception of a player's makeup may be much different in Oakland than it is in Boston, where this. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Craig's probably the best guy to describe the different environment. He's been in Oakland and in Boston. We've always been we're second team in a two-market town, and it's.
I'm just thinking whether or not it's possible to discern if a guy is difficult with the media in Oakland.
Yes. Well, hey, listen, Jane's here, right up there. But it is a different environment, and therefore, a guy's makeup may play different in Oakland than it would in Boston. So it's not I don't think you can cookie cutter.
Do you find it's created opportunities for you where you could rescue a damaged asset in your market?
Yeah, like that Castro guy that's supposed to have a bad makeup. He'd be great
fine.
in Oakland.
He's fine. He's a Chicago kind of guy.
Heard he's down. Yeah, listen, we always have to sort of operate on the edges a little bit. And so there has been time, like, Craig, he's a bad makeup guy. We took him in Oakland. Listen,
People ask
actually,
why
being a Yale
switch
guy is
teams
not
so
necessarily, being a Yale guy is not necessarily a badge of honor, right? When you're in baseball, right? So, but no, you're right. And it is, what Theo's worked in two big markets. I've always been in a small market, and Craig's played in both. Listen, what you can do in Boston may not work in Oakland, and vice versa. It's just that we have to do things all differently. We have to find our space. And once again, not to interrupt Craig, but he's played in both places, so he could probably comment.
Right. No, I think that's true. And I mean, while it's very early in this season and potentially premature, I don't know that there's a greater example of just kind of overall, culture change and chemistry change from this year's Red Sox team as compared to last year's. But obviously, you guys would probably be, I would assume, would be very quick to understand that talent wins ultimately. But and so while the greatest of guys and great makeup and great chemistry may not win, most winning teams do have that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Is that I've always seen chemistry and is somewhat of a byproduct of having. I mean, we had Craig in Oakland. I'm not saying he's here. Craig is good at players you'd want on your team, and he's a great influence on the players. But we just weren't at the time talented enough. We had a lot of injuries. But once you sort of breed the chemistry really enhances a winning team. When you've got really good guys and they start winning, then it really blossoms. And I mean, because you can have a good team and not necessarily have guys that get along and still win in spite of it. But when you have one of the guys in town here with the Red Sox we had last year was Johnny Gomes, and Johnny's a lot of fun to have around. I mean, we had a good team and we had talent, but when you start winning and you have those type of personalities, it really comes out.
And that's so true about. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule or theory, and the Oakland days of the long before your time, or early '70s, were amazing.
I was born, Peter.
Yes, but I mean, there was in 1972. You come in and then. Vita Blue comes in relief for Blue Moon Odom and pitches 5 innings, and they win the pennant over the Detroit Tigers, and we're all going into the clubhouse, and Vita Blue and Blue Moon Odom in a fist fight on the floor because when Odom came in, he had been the starter. And Vita was giving him the choke sign. So, and then before the first game of the 2004 World Series with the Dodgers, we went in on the off day and Billy North and Reggie Jackson were rolling on the floor in a fist fight, so over another matter, which we'll leave blank. But those things do happen.
So on the question of makeup, Nate Silver in his new book talks about Dustin Pedroia, and he makes it sound like Pedroia is 100% makeup and 0% skills. So I'd like to hear Theo comment on that, and I'd also like to hear Billy comment on the fact that he was touted as somebody who had all 5 skills and didn't make it. I don't know if it's because Darryl Strawberry was batting behind you. What was the makeup issue with you?
All right, Dr. Phil.
I told you I was going to be an amateur psychologist today.
You know what? Listen,
Actually,
I have no problem answering the question. The great thing about baseball, it's very Darwinian. I mean, there's great talent. But to get through the minor leagues, to play 162 games, it is a grind. Some people have the talent. Some people, I'd go crazy if I went 0 for 3. I had too much going on in my mind. I came up in the Met system. We had take a guy like Lenny Dykstra who had the ability. I always said this is the greatest example of like me and Lenny played outfield next to each other. And if I was 2 for 2 in a game, I figured at worst I'm 2 for 4. Lenny figures I'm going 4 for 4. And that was the type of mentality these guys had. And if Lenny was 0 for 4 in a game, he wanted to get that 5th at bat because he was going to go 1 for 5. Whereas, guys who start thinking, I don't want to get up again, I'm going to go 0 for 5. Let's just forget this day and start over. But that's just sort of an example of the type of makeup guys. I mean, baseball players, this is such a long season, and it's not just talent and skill, but these guys are really mentally tough, mentally strong guys. And the minor leagues weeds out. Listen, guys have talent. And, Craig, we've all been around guys who have great physical ability but don't have the mental makeup. And that's why I've always said there's never been a Hall of Famer that just languished in AAA. They find a way to either get there if they're good enough. Matt Stairs, one of my all-time favorites. 26 years old. He spent 17 years in the big leagues. He was doing all the right things. The game wasn't necessarily recognizing him. He was getting on base. He was hitting homers, but because he sort of didn't fit the mold. But when he finally got the opportunity, he finally decided when he was going to stop playing. But he once again, he went through the process. He got kind of pushed back, but finally, the cream rises to the top. So I always say, listen, I wasn't good enough in some ways, and I don't have a problem with that.
We certainly liked Dustin Pedroia's makeup in the draft room when talking about his career at Arizona State. But the reason we took him with our first pick was because he had the highest ratio of extra base hits to strikeouts in the country. He barreled everything he swung at. He had the best hands in the country. He had the best defensive numbers in the country, and was only available in the second round because he was 5 foot whatever, 5'7". If he had a great body, he would have been one of the top 3 or 5 players picked in the whole country. So the makeup was excellent, and it served well, and he's the leader of this club and has just about ideal makeup. But an extremely talented guy who's often not given credit for his talent because he's called gritty and scrappy because he's short.
I think it's interesting. How often do you hear a bad player labeled with off-the-charts makeup? It seems that they always go hand in hand.
Or a bad team with great chemistry.
Right.
We weren't any good this year, guys. We're bringing them all back. You never hear that one.
As you start to look at what gets valued, for instance, this winter, we saw in the free agent market that starting pitching went right through the roof as far as prices concerned. Is there now, and Billy, you have traded a few young pitchers over the last 5 years. Does part of the business come to try, okay, I can get more for a young pitcher than I can for a guy who's 33 years old, and you start thinking about, gee, maybe it's a good idea, as much as I like this guy at 25 years old, to trade him because I can get more for him now?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the importance of supply and demand and understanding the whole landscape of the game. But you could understand a player extremely well, what makes him tick, how good he is, how proficient he is in a lot of different areas of the game. But if you don't understand how he fits into the entire landscape, the trade landscape, the economic landscape of the game, you're not actually maximizing that asset. So, I think Billy's traded a number of young pitchers the last few years that he probably loved and helped his team win quite a bit. But the bottom line was, there was more demand in the marketplace for that pitcher. There was so much demand that he could convert it into a series of assets that in total were more valuable, to his operation.
I take Gio Gonzalez and Trevor Cahill, for example.
You gonna remind me of that again, Peter?
No, I mean, it was interesting that you traded them both.
Cahill was the throw-in in the Breslow.
I mean, for us, sometimes, listen, we have to trade. We have to trade good players because we need more than one good player. In the case of Trevor and Breslow and Gio, and Andrew actually, we took those were our last three All-Stars, and listen, we were a third place team with them, and we, instead of trying to trade players who weren't so good, we needed to trade players who were good because we needed a lot of good players. So we took those 3 players and turned them into 10. It was a multiplier for us, and worked out for us last year, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, but for us, that's the risk of running a small market. We can't let a player exhaust his sort of asset value to us when he leaves and he walks away. We got to make sure that we're getting players in return to try and keep some sort of cycle up.
Every time there's a free agent signing, it's a data point in the marketplace, and you should take a look at what that means about how the market is valuing players and what that means about your own assets. So if you see a player sign for more than you thought he would get, well, perhaps it means that type of player is being valued disproportionately, and that affects the trade value versus the retention value of those players on your roster. So it's constantly fluid and changing. But free agency, every free agent signing dictates a little bit about how you think about the trade market as well.
How frustrating is it for people who love scouting development, as you both do, to now have the new draft rules and the restrictions on how much you can pay, plus the restrictions on what you can pay internationally? Does that hamper a small or medium market team?
That's a good one for you.
Neither one of us wants to get fined, right? TV, but,
It's still, the CBA is somewhat fluid as well. We're still sort of we've only gone through, we haven't gone through a number of cycles yet. But, I mean, we'll see the long-term effects of the impact of reduced, or at least having some sort of caps. I don't think any of us know if it's good or bad yet anyways, because we've only went through, really last year's the first draft we had it with.
Yeah. And, I'm an advocate of more flexibility for teams, deciding how much they value draft picks, how much they want to spend in the draft versus in the free agent market. With the Red Sox, we were a big market team, but we understood from the very beginning that a big part of our strategy, because we had the big payrolls, we could churn draft picks, and we knew the draft wasn't an exact science, so we wanted to accumulate as many first-round sandwich picks as we could, and we ended up having almost twice as many selections in the first round as any other club over a decade, because we incorporated that into our strategy, and we had the benefit of the resources behind it. And that's a big reason why we hit on the Dustin Pedroias and Buchholz's and Lester's and so on of the world, because we had more shots at it than other clubs did. And that was a conscious decision, and that's the type of decision that franchises won't be able to make now, because there's more restrictions. So it does create more of a scouting contest where it puts every team in the same boat. But if you like long-term strategy, and if you like deciding how you're going to allocate your resources at the highest level, the game is just, that element of the game is not quite as exciting or interesting as it was a couple of years ago.
Let me give just a word of background on Peter's question, because I suspect that not all of you know exactly what he was referring to. In the last CBA, which took hold last year, there's now a limit on how much each team can spend on the amateur draft, and also a limit on how much they can spend when they sign international amateurs who are not part of the amateur draft. And that limit is in inverse order to where you finish in the standings. So the team that finishes last might have $6 million they can spend on bonuses to sign a draft pick, and a team that finishes first might have $2 million. I'm simplifying a little bit. And this is all in the name of promoting competitive balance. For me, one of the problems with it, and I can get fined too because I work for the commissioner's office, but I'll say it anyway. One of the problems with it is that when you allocate resources according to the order of finish, rather than according to the size of the market, then you are penalizing small market teams that do well, and you're rewarding large market teams that do poorly. There's Billy Beane and the Oakland A's are in a small market, and they won their division. You won your division last year, right, Billy? Yeah. So they won their division last year, and they end up getting penalized as a small market team for being successful. They get less money this year to spend on signing amateurs. It seems to me that's the wrong way to go about it. If you want to promote balance, you want to level the playing field, you have a reverse order system, but it's reverse order according to market size, not reverse order according to win percentage.
I do think there's a bit of a counter argument to that as well, because I think it's becoming understood across the game that the worst return on investment in the industry is found in the free agent market, in particular big money free agent contracts. So if you completely restrict the ability of mid or larger market clubs to invest heavily in the draft, especially ones that are starting with a system that was largely bereft of talent and a major league roster that needs a significant overhaul, you then force those teams into free agency, and it's a fine line, because you run the risk of having teams in big markets that count, that are on TV a lot, that help drive the economic engine of the game, the New Yorks, the Bostons, the LAs, the Chicagos, of having all those clubs having the rosters of those clubs consist almost exclusively of free agent talent. So, if those big market teams want to take a step back and invest in the draft, there's an argument that they should, especially if their payroll is only third in their division and all the other teams in the division get extra picks through the competitive balance system already in place.
So about the free agent market, in hockey, in football, and in basketball, their CBAs all have limits on the length of time you can sign a player. Most free agents in baseball don't become free agents until they're 28, 29, and many go through for the second time in their early and mid-30s. Should baseball have a limit? Or alternatively, does it ever make sense for a GM to sign a pitcher for more than 5 years from the free agent market?
I'd love a limit. I mean, I think the biggest problem with the long-term investments is being forced because of supply and demand, and in free agency that means a lot of demand always for talented players and very limited supply. But the biggest problem is paying for years at the end of the contract that going in won't be productive, because the aging curve in baseball does not align whatsoever with the compensation curve. So you're forced to pay for past performance. So any sort of limitation on the length of contract would help eliminate that phenomenon. But I think the Players Association would go up in arms over anything resembling that.
Well, and you can understand why. I mean, if Albert Pujols with bad knees, 30-something years old, and plantar fasciitis can get $250 million for 10 years, how can they turn around to the rest of the players in the union and say, oh, we're now restricted?
I would say, good luck. But I mean,
I was just saying, thank God for your antitrust exemption, because if I was having this discussion with someone from Getty or 7-Eleven, it wouldn't be a fine. I'd be going to jail after lunch.
No, this discussion is the antitrust, the non-statutory labor exemption covers baseball and all the other sports. It allows them to put these limits down. But look, Wiener's different than Fear. The guy who's the head of the Players Association now, he's much more collaborative, I think. But look, if you said to the Angels, you can't sign Pujols for 10 years, you can only sign him for 5 years, his average annual salary, instead of being $25 million or $26 million, is going to go higher. It's going to set the bar higher for other players when they bargain with their teams. I don't think ultimately it's something that's going to hurt the total amount of wages or salaries that gets paid to players to have to impose that limit.
I would say you could be right. It may not hurt overall dollars spent, but I mean, throughout history, the Players Association has always opposed manipulating the market.
Any kind of limitation, but again, if you get the bar higher, if all of a sudden instead of Alex Rodriguez's, he could get $35 million this year if he hit 6 home runs, instead of him being the bar, if Pujols is the bar at $36 million for 4 years or something like that, then other players have something higher to shoot for. I just think it's an argument that can be tried on Wiener, and it could work.
How much has the increase, the boom in the regional sports networks, the Dodgers and Angels, classic examples, how much have they changed the industry in the last 3 years?
Say, Peter, I'm sorry, I didn't.
The regional sports networks. How much have the RSNs impacted the game?
The RSNs are having a really interesting impact on the game right now. I think we're in the midst of a bubble. The Dodgers seem to, although the contract isn't finalized, the Dodgers seem to be receiving somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million a year. That's an unheard of sum of money. It's going to upset the apple cart in terms of competitive balance. It's going to raise lots of issues for teams in terms of how much they have to contribute to the revenue sharing pool. So I think it's going to create internal, not only does it create greater revenue imbalances potentially, but it's creating more internal conflict amongst the owners about having a revenue sharing system that's treated fairly and treated according to the same rules. So I think it's a very big deal. A related question is how long it's going to go on. And I don't think I have the time to elaborate on this, but I think that there are specific forces that are pushing that market right now that will dissipate and the bubble will burst. And so teams that have signed in the last year or two new agreements, and teams that sign a new agreement in the next year or two are in the middle of the upswing, and they're benefited by that. And other teams, whether they're in large markets or not, that signed an agreement before or will sign one afterwards, are going to be hurt by that. But this is an area of tremendous institutional and technological change, and what we've all become used to as the means of delivery of our sports and our baseball is something that might look very different in 5 years.
But Andrew, I have a question for you because I was confused on the antitrust. I just lost a head division, important performer, to Sunoco. So I can call up the president or CEO of Sunoco and say you shouldn't have offered him that money. I wish you wouldn't. Let's agree you won't hire any more of my people.
No. So what the non-statutory labor exemption
There are
says.
lawyers in this room. I'd like the advice.
All right, we'll talk about it afterwards.
One thing, we would like to open up to some questions. Billy has to to go in about 15 minutes because he's got a plane to catch. So if people have questions, we're very much open to addressing them. Yes, sir.
Do you find that players are actually adjusting the way they play the game based on the knowledge how you recruit?
You speak Boston. I don't. You're from.
The question is, are players changing the way they play the game based on the way we recruit? I don't know. Craig might be the best one to answer that. He talked about how it reaffirmed that he didn't need to make fundamental changes in his game. But I think so. I think players are aware. Their agents certainly market the players individually to certain teams. If there are teams that I don't know, take 8 years ago, teams that liked on-base percentage, the agent certainly stressed that, in their presentation, and they sort of, they know that, certain profile player fit in certain organizations, and will market those players there. But I don't know whether it affects the way players actually play the game. Certainly at the amateur level, I don't think that goes on.
I would say, kind of akin to the debate among front office personnel between statistics and kind of scouting. There are players that, totally eschew this whole brand, and also those players who have adopted it. And probably the best documented example would be Brandon McCarthy, who kind of reinvented himself as a sabermetrics baby, getting a ton of ground balls, not walking guys. And obviously his success, as I said, is pretty well documented.
Any other questions?
There's a bunch over there.
Thanks. So if the verdict's in that the free agent market doesn't offer very good return, and you're restricted on how much you can spend on amateurs, and you have 6 years of player control, where does someone tasked with capital allocation try to find an advantage? How do Billy and Theo think about that? Might you give a prospect a 5 or 6 year deal who maybe has never played a major league game the way Longoria got or something? Like, how do you think about capital allocation in this environment?
I don't have any capital, Theo, so you got to answer that.
I don't have as much as I want either. Certainly I think there's been a trend towards longer-term deals for players with less major league service, and asset retention is extremely important now because fewer and fewer players are hitting the free agent market. You have to either keep the good players you have through their primes, and you can buy those years at more affordable rates the earlier you're willing to make that commitment, or convert that asset into higher volume of potential impact players early on. But that's the question that keeps the big market teams up at night these days. Is okay, it's one thing to have an advantage as far as the amount of dollars that you have, but if there aren't effective places to spend that money, what do you do with that advantage? And there's a greater percentage of dollars now going towards off-the-field investment. So I think teams are realizing that maybe you can get a greater advantage, spending the extra couple $100,000 on analysts or scouts, or paying your employees better so you can then keep them and retain that intellectual capital, building research and development departments to come up with the next great innovation. We're spending money now on, we work with a couple neuroscientists trying to find better training techniques for hitters and things that we probably wouldn't do if we could just look out there and spend a couple $1 million on David Ortiz, Kevin Millar, and Bill Miller instead. But that's a decade in the rearview mirror now.
My question is, how do you invest in urban baseball? We know there's some great athletes. We also know the AAU programs. People are spending $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year, but there's just tremendous athletes around the country that are trying to figure out how to re-engage back into America's pastime. So I think, as we know last week with the commissioner, really looking to figure out how we can activate a lot of great athletes. Peter and Theo and folks know we do a great job of this in Boston. But as we travel the country, there's a lot of young folks who are looking for the opportunity. But I guess I asked, what's Major League Baseball's role to get back into cities for America's pastime?
So baseball has had a program called RBI, Returning Baseball to the Inner Cities. It's been around since at least the mid-'90s, and I think they've made some interesting progress with that. They've set up some baseball academies also. They have something called the Fan Cave, which is supposed to make baseball cool again, speaking to baseball, to the younger demographic that follow baseball. It's clear, though, African Americans are, I think the last figure is they're just under 8% of professional baseball players. It had been drifting up a little bit for several years, but last year it drifted down. So it's pretty clear that more needs to be done. I think it's a good sign that Commissioner Seelig set up this commission. Personally, I wish that they would put some social scientists on the commission, because I think that they would have a better sense of maybe how you approach this, how you reach people in the inner cities. But it's something that baseball is very aware of and is trying hard, relatively hard, to rectify.
In addition to the investment by Major League Baseball in the 30 clubs, I think it's important to recognize that the marketplace operates out of self-interest. So teams that are willing to invest in inner city athletes and then derive a benefit from that, by signing those players who then turn out to make an impact on your organization, that behavior will be copied. And there are reasons. Take international scouting. The first team into a new market often derives the greatest advantage, and then the copycats come, and then the smartest teams are on to the next frontier. Well, the same is true for the inner city. The team that can best convert that investment into actual benefit, I think, will be important, because then others will follow.
I mean, one thing, and Robert, of course, is a great friend of ours, and the South End Baseball Program is the largest free program in the United States, and not only do they develop players, but they have more than 50 of their players that are now playing college baseball, which is phenomenal. And that leads to another thing. The NCAA couldn't care less. You get 10 scholarships for a 30 to 35-man team. There is no money. You have to be middle to upper middle class to be able to play college baseball at this point. They don't have full scholarships, and and the NCAA isn't going to change, because it's all about football. So I do believe that Major League Baseball has to find ways to get young players going, and program. Darryl Miller from the Academy in Los Angeles and I have talked a lot about it, and trying to look other places where they can develop these programs and get them going, whether it's junior colleges, places where it doesn't cost a lot of money to play. But it is something lacking in the sport, and I think it's an asset to the industry, but it's just very difficult because of the NCAA.
Gentlemen, over here now.
Hi, thanks for your comments. Billy, you spoke to it earlier, how, and it's thoroughly documented, how special and a successful culture you've built in Oakland in a small market. If and when Cisco Field ever gets approved, how do you think that's going to change your role, and what hopes and challenges do you think that's going to confront for you?
You're referring to a possible new venue, is that?
Yeah, I mean, markets don't move too often, or teams don't move too often, but you're facing a potential move to Silicon Valley in a few years, and I would imagine that might change your job.
Yeah, well, I mean, at some point we're going to have a new venue, wherever it is yet to be determined. But I think one of the things, and Theo kind of touched on it a little bit, I think if you asked me and Theo, if we had one thing, if we could draft, develop, and keep our own players, and when I mean keep, having capital, it's not just about signing free agents, okay? Having capital allows you to take a Gio Gonzalez, and keep him through the rest of his career. And, a new venue for us would give us the opportunity to have a 5, 6, 7-year plan, which you really need when you're doing long-term contracts. Good players sign long contracts. And not all those contracts that are long are bad, too, by the way. There's a lot of guys Greg Maddux was a free agent, and he was worth every penny the Braves paid him during that time. So it's just, sometimes a hit, sometimes miss. But for us, we're in a hand-to-mouth situation in the current situation, because we're going year to year. And so the idea that we could actually plan for 5 or 7 years, that's what a new venue would allow us to do, where you could keep players hopefully in their prime, and instead of having to move them.
You're going to be able to afford Jed Lowry another year?
Over here.
Don't stress me out, Peter. All right?
So would you rather have a great young hitter to start your team with, like Buster Posey, or a great young pitcher like Clayton Kershaw?
Either one would be fine with me. I think we could find room on our roster for either if we look hard enough. Now, I'd probably take the hitter just because of the certainty of performance. There's more attrition. No offense, Craig. There's more attrition with pitching just due to injury and how difficult the active pitching is on the human body. So the hitter over the long term is probably the safer bet.
Back to the side.
I had a question. Actually, Peter discussed it just a minute ago about college baseball not being brought to the forefront or something along those lines. My question is going to be for Andrew and Peter regarding that. Was that since we're not developing, baseball, the college baseball and all that stuff, what do you feel could be done to help develop college baseball to become more prominent, to build up the scholarships necessary? Because as Buster only said recently that there are some very good baseball players on football teams right now. Their third string safety's not even playing because of the lack of scholarships. Thank you.
The NCAA, as far as I'm concerned, is a trade association of athletic directors and conference commissioners and coaches, and it's not in their interests to shift scholarships from football and basketball to any of the other sports. I don't see any way to move that organization at the moment. I mean, and there are much more pressing issues that the NCAA is struggling with. Perhaps there could be an independent scholarship fund that was set up that would help endow baseball scholarships. Perhaps Major League Baseball could try to get involved and endow more baseball scholarships, but I think that those would just be incremental, wouldn't have a major effect.
Scott Boras actually tried to explore an idea like this and to start a fund to be able to help, particularly minority, be able to get into college baseball, and the NCAA frowned upon. Now, there are occasional cases. Kevin Brown, for instance, has taken two kids who were very poor that played in high school with his sons in Macon, Georgia, and is paying their way through Georgia Tech, and they're both honor students, by the way. But that is difficult to do sometimes. It's just as Eric Hosmer essentially paid a scholarship for Devin Marrero, the Red Sox #1 pick last year at Arizona State. But it's very difficult to do.
I'm curious what you all think the possibility is for a restructuring of the various rules, salary caps, luxury taxes that might level the playing field between the larger markets and the smaller markets. You talked earlier about the RSNs, and as evidenced by the Dodgers price tag, that there is a new dynamic in the last decade or so that is, my sense is anyway, increasing the relative value of the large market teams. And at some point, whether labor or small market teams, there's pressure to change that. All rights have gone up, the pie has grown, but my sense is it's grown a lot faster in the large markets.
The collective bargaining agreement was just signed last year, and it goes through 2015. There's not going to be any fundamental reorganization of the institutions of baseball's labor market or revenue sharing, at least until 2016 or 2017. Beyond that, there are lots of ideas that are being discussed in baseball, but I don't think it makes sense for me to begin to get into them, because I'll happily talk to you about it afterwards. I just don't want to take up too much time.
How would you assess the parity in the game now compared to historical levels or compared to the other industries?
So baseball, usually you measure, I think the single best measurement of parity is looking at the standard deviation of win percentages. You can look at some other measurements also, but the standard deviation of win percentages actually fell. The lower it gets, the more balance there is across the teams. It fell every decade from the beginning of the modern era, 1903, until 1990. In 1990, it leveled off and then started to rise, and it rose all the way until 2007. So it's interesting that the standard deviation of win percentages was getting wider, there's less balance, during precisely those years when revenue sharing was introduced in baseball. That dates back to 1996. And I think the reason for it is that originally the revenue sharing system in baseball had perverse incentives. It actually had embedded in it a higher marginal tax rate for the low revenue teams than for the high revenue teams. But that was corrected in 2007, and now it's improving again. If you look at the number of teams that have gone to the World Series and compare that to the number of teams that have gone to the NFL Championship or the number of teams that have gone to the NBA Finals or the Stanley Cup, baseball actually does pretty well. And part of that, though, is an artifact of introducing wild cards and a second wild card rather than the underlying balance of teams.
Right here, guys.
My question is, I'm over here on this side. My question is, why haven't analytics had more of an effect on the design of the lineup? When I was a kid, we used to play that game, Stratomatic or Strategomatic baseball. Remember that game? And we learned if you bunched all your highest average or highest on-base percentage people at the front of your lineup, you'd score more runs in a game, and especially over a number of games. If you put Willie Mays in the leadoff position, you score more runs. It would mean putting your power players higher in the lineup in 1 and 2, and people are stuck in this, the belief that you should always have your power hitters in 3 to 5. But mathematically, and I think it's only algebra, if you put all the high on-base percentage people bunched towards the front, you'd score more runs. When is somebody going to have the nerve to try that?
You available? I think you make a very valid point, but I think it's important to recognize that it's pretty hard to screw up a lineup. Like the impact, the benefit you actually get from subtle changes in your lineup isn't that vast. It's not necessarily the battle worth fighting, because traditional lineup construction isn't perfect, but it's not terrible either. Like to really adversely affect your team, you'd need to hit some of your worst hitters up high in the lineup, and there aren't too many managers that would do that. So you're right, the lineups aren't necessarily optimized, but they're also not that bad, and you're talking about a fairly de minimis number of runs over the course of the season.
I agree with Theo, but you should also take a look at what Casey Stengel did with the Yankees in the 1950s, batted Elston Howard and Norm Serve first for a long time. These very slow-footed power hitters. Worked out pretty well for him.
Yeah, I think it goes on more than, lineup. There's a lot of, like a manager, when he goes over a lineup, it will be the thing that can happen also during the game. So he sets up a lineup to also impact maybe moves a manager on the other side can or cannot make. But I think it happens more than maybe you think, and I know the conversations, and as Theo said, there's not a huge impact over the course of a season, but there is slight, and listen, sometimes the game comes out to small differences. But I think you'd be surprised because, you take, I know certainly Tampa and Joe Madden put quite a bit of thought into how they make their lineup as they do their defensive shifts for small little advantages. And I certainly know in Oakland the conversations that you're talking about, we have them. But once again, the game, there's a lot of changes that can or cannot happen. And sometimes your lineup construction can prevent a move that you don't want having to happen. Like you don't want a Breslow facing you, so you set your lineup so that so Breslow doesn't come to the game as an example. But so it does happen maybe more than you think. But I think Theo's point is the most important. Is, as I said, you got good hitters. And Babe Ruth, whether you hit him first, third, eighth, he's good wherever he is, and it's not going to have a huge impact. It really comes down to more at bats. But La Russa did it a little bit when he hit the pitcher eighth, because there was when he looked at some of the things, you could see there was a slight advantage to having those situations come out.
I think it's slowly improving too. You'll see slower leadoff hitters now certainly than you did 15 years ago. If they get on base a little bit more, it's more accepted. You used to have scouts laugh at you if you put someone who's a below average runner lead off, and now it's fairly accepted that getting on base is the most important part of leading off.
As the Cincinnati Reds have shown, since they had the lowest on-base percentage out of the leadoff spot in 31 years last year, they traded for a guy that supposedly can't play center field, and now they're leading the league in runs.
You sound like a Reds fan or something, Peter.
No, I just always
sound
liked
bad.
you. I mean, he's leading the major leagues in on base, and they're up.
This has
up
been
200
bugging you
points.
all day, hasn't it?
No.
I apologize, but I have to run. But I want to thank Peter for having me, Theo, and I've heard all these great things about Paul these years, that he's really the smart brother in the Epstein family. So, but I appreciate you guys coming out as well, too. Peter talks about this more than he talks about baseball, and I know him and Theo are extremely proud, and Paul as well, and they're proud of the commitment the community has made to the foundation. So thanks for having me. We're playing tonight, and we're here, which means I have to leave. So I'm actually.
Thanks, Billy.
Yeah.
Thanks, good job.
Nice meeting you, Joe.
Thanks a lot.
Andrew, good seeing you.